I work at a hospital a town over from where I live, and I work as an environmental service person, aka housekeeping. Every hospital worker has to wear a badge with a picture, first name, and your department listed on it. I'm a 5'2" woman, if that matters at all. I used to park out in the front of the hospital instead of our designated parking space. 1, it was more lit out in the front, and 2, it just seemed more convenient. Now I park in the back in our designated area and walk out with a coworker who leaves at the same time I do. When I get to work, it's still in the early evening, so around 4ish or so. Normally, we have a few people outside/inside our waiting/wheelchair area. You'll occasionally get a few, "Hey, can you help me with this?" or "Do you know what floor so-and-so is?" People coming up to you because you're wearing scrubs and have a badge is not uncommon or weird, except for this one time. I got to work a little bit early so I could eat before clocking in and just get right to it. I was walking across the little crosswalk from the parking lot to the entrance when I hear a, Miss, could you help me with something?" I turn around and see a decently dressed man in his mid-30s. "Oh, sure, what could I help you with?" "My wife is on the 3rd floor, but I just can't figure out what entrance I'm supposed to use." "Oh, sure, you'll want to use this one, because the one all the way around to the left is for the emergency room. The one all the way to the right is for physical therapy in the senior center." "Okay, thanks. And what time do the doors lock exactly?" 8 o'clock, I believe." He nodded and walked through the doors. I didn't think that much of it, other than if his wife was on the 3rd floor, he should have known what door to use. I mean, it had main entrance written right on the front. I told my shift manager, who radioed to security to maybe keep an eye out for some weirdness. I continued working throughout the day and finally finished my shift. It was around midnight when I finally got outside the doors and halfway through the crosswalk when I heard, "Hey, it's good to see you." I turned around to see the same guy from earlier waiting on the bench outside. I gave a polite nod and continued my way to my car while unlocking my phone. I pulled up my shift manager's office phone number and got ready to call. "Hey, I want to talk to you. Come and chat." "Sorry, it's late, and I have people up and waiting for me at home." "Do you live around here?" "Come on, you're a pretty girl, and I'm a decent guy. Why wouldn't you want to chat?" I ignored him and just continued to walk as fast as I could without running. I could hear him speeding up behind me to follow me. After that sentence, I was about a foot or so away from my car. I pushed my automatic lock and swung my purse off my shoulder so I could chuck it into my car and slam myself in. "Hey!" I slammed my purse in, then slammed myself in, all while locking my doors and slamming my key in, getting ready to leave. He reached my car and pounded his fist on my window. "That's not cool, my name. Let's chat." I'm done talking to this guy at this point. I was seriously ready to just get home. I revved my car, letting him know that if he wasn't going to move, I was going to run over his foot. It was a good thing he was right next to the ER so he could limp over and explain how his foot got in that mess. I pulled my car out of park and slowly, one more time, revved my engine. He knew I was not fucking around. He stepped back and I pulled up to a few parking spaces before speeding out and getting out onto the road. The drive home was spent on the phone with my shift manager, who was radioing security to see if he was still out there and if they could see him anywhere else on location. They couldn't find him, but they did check the cameras. They saw that earlier in the day he'd been following me. Then, after I left, he'd followed me a bit too before meeting me. About 2 minutes after our confrontation, it showed him running away. I spent some time with security, and they told me they were going to forward this all to the police, then to use our designated parking space from now on. They also said to call if I saw him in the building or on shift, or when coming out of work in the future. Halloween 2015. That Halloween night started with myself and my buddy getting ready and putting on our costumes at my buddy's house. For the sake of privacy, I'll refer to him as Brad. Brad and I had been invited to a party by the girl he was dating. I was going dressed as a dead construction worker, while Brad was dressed up in his Maverick from Top Gun costume. We both looked pretty dumb, as we hadn't put very much effort into our costumes. He was just excited about seeing the girl he had just started dating, and I was equally excited to meet and flirt with some new girls that night. Once we were both ready to go, we headed out. Brad's new girl had sent us a text with the address attached. We GPS'd it, and Brad drove us both to the party. It was about 30 miles away, on the outskirts of our city out in the country. We drove down a very long, dark street with no street lamps, and eventually made it to the house. The house was at the end of a long driveway. When we pulled up, we saw a good number of cars and trucks parked out front. I'd say there were about 20 or so. We were both pretty psyched, as this party looked to be quite awesome. Music was blaring from inside the house. The outside was lit up with black lights and decorated with all sorts of Halloween stuff. Red light was pouring out of the windows from inside. This place was a 2-story too, so it was very nice. It was surrounded by acres of farmland, and there was not another house in sight. When we went inside, we found Brad's girl sitting on a couch in the living room, talking to 2 of her friends. We sat down and Brad's girl said hello. She came over to us, sitting next to Brad. She was dressed up as a vampire. The 2 people she had been talking to were wearing masks. One of them was a guy, and the other was clearly a girl. The girl was wearing a ghost face mask, and the guy was wearing just a mask with normal clothes on. His mask was one of those black blank face masks. We all talked for a while, with people rushing around us, dancing and getting hammered. The guy was really quiet though. He only spoke whenever somebody else spoke to him. I honestly thought he was a little bit weird and creepy. It didn't seem like he was having a good time either. We assumed that the 2 of them had come together, but we found out that the ghost-faced girl had come with 2 other girls. The guy said he had come with one of his friends, but apparently he couldn't find him now. After a couple hours of talking, laughing, and drinking, my vision was starting to get blurry. I was getting pretty damn drunk. Brad and his girl had long since gotten off the couch and walked off somewhere. The other 2 were still talking to each other on the couch right next to me. They seemed to be flirting and having a lot of fun at this point. I was just kind of people-watching, sipping on my 5th mixed drink of Jack and Coke. That was when I noticed the blank-faced guy kept leaning his head back. I'm pretty sure he was looking upstairs at the bedroom doors. I couldn't tell because with his mask I couldn't quite see his eyes. The ghost-faced girl didn't seem to notice this though. She was all over him, talking his ear off. At some point, I positioned one of the couch pillows behind my head and started to drift off to sleep. Going in and out of consciousness, I woke up for a moment completely and looked around the room. My head was spinning at this point. There were way less people walking around. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 3:45 a.m. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and leaned my head back on the pillow. I was going to get some sleep again. I started to close my eyes, but right before I did so, I noticed that blank face guy leading the ghost face girl up the stairs. Her head was down. She looked like she was barely awake. He was helping her walk up the steps and they disappeared into the bedroom. Next thing I knew, Brad was shaking me and telling me he wanted to leave. I asked if he was cool to drive, and he assured me he was. I got to my feet. The room was spinning. It felt like I was going to puke right there. I managed to make it outside though. The sun had just gone up when we made it back to Brad's house. We both collapsed on his couches and passed out. Hours later, I awoke to Brad's sister, waking him up and questioning him. She asked if we had gone to that party out in the country. When we said yes, she was completely frantic. She told us somebody had been killed there last night. I became completely awake upon hearing this, and so did Brad. I sat there silent. Brad was asking who it was and what had happened to them. His sister said she didn't know the girl's name yet, but she had been found murdered in an upstairs bedroom. She had been stabbed to death. I thought to myself, there's no way. Sure enough, to my disbelief, later on that day, they showed us the girl that was killed. It was that very same ghost-faced girl from that night. She had been stabbed 36 times. The police questioned everybody who was at the party on Halloween, including Brad and I. Of course, I told them immediately about that suspicious guy who had brought her upstairs. That he was wearing blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and a black blank face mask. To my knowledge, though, they never found that guy. The person who hosted the party said she'd never invited that guy, nor did she see him there. Some context first. This story took place in 2020 when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general, so take that with a pinch of salt. My dad had passed away earlier in the year, and I have no siblings either, so my mom and I lived all alone in our house. The COVID lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people were starting to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a big stretch of empty field. It became a safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house for a while. I would normally sit there once a day for a cigarette or two, sometimes having my own little picnic. My home situation was complicated to say the least, and due to the pandemic, I had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke as I always did. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks on the other side of the field. He was barefoot and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. The man noticed me and made a hand gesture suggesting he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it quite difficult to say no to people. I walked a bit towards him and offered him a smoke. He took it from me, but immediately I felt uneasy about the way he was looking at me. The man asked me, "Don't you live in that house right over there?" He pointed right at my exact address. I avoided answering his question, and at this point I realized I needed to leave right now. I had left from my front gate that day. For him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going. He started insisting on giving me a hug to say thank you though. I declined several times, and at this point I started backing away quickly. I didn't get very far though. The man easily caught up to me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I panicked, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away from this man. As I tried to start running from his grip, he grabbed me harder from behind and started dragging me towards the row of houses where the view of the road was completely blocked off. The fences were high too, so no one could see that area from their backyards. We were completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of his grasp. He ended up throwing me against the ground, with him jumping on top of me, still holding on. In a split second, my life flashed before my eyes. That feeling that something terrible was about to happen came over me. I couldn't escape. This man was too strong. My arms were trapped by his, and he was holding me down so I couldn't kick him. I did the only thing left to do. I started screaming desperately for help. Suddenly, I was free. I could move again. He had let go and jumped off of me. He ran away so fast I could barely even register it. My heart was pounding furiously. I was shaking in shock from what had just happened. He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran towards the road. As I reached it, I noticed it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbor's driveways either. No one heard me screaming, and had he realized that day would have had a far worse ending for me. He clearly knew where I lived, and I was terrified of him returning. For months after, I had panic attacks and nightmares, and I could barely leave my house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I still sometimes get scared when I'm home alone or when I have to walk around town. Hello, I have a story to share with you all. This happened to me about 15 years ago. I lived near the ocean, and I frequented a certain spot on the beach all the time. It was a very lonely spot, and not many people ever showed up there. This one Saturday afternoon, as I recall, I was lying out in the sand in my spot, relaxing and getting a tan on. It's not uncommon for me to fall asleep while doing this, as I sometimes did if the sun was not too hot on my skin. This particular day, I had fallen asleep. I woke up a while later to the sun now setting. I realized I must have been sleeping for quite a while. When I looked over to my left, I was startled to see a woman sitting right next to me in the sand. Not on a towel or anything. She was wearing jeans shorts and a bathing suit top. She had very striking red hair as well. At first, I didn't even really acknowledge her. There were a couple of other people around further along the beach, but after glancing at her a few times, I noticed she was just kind of staring out into the ocean. She didn't even turn to look at me, or anybody else really. I felt a bit of curiosity and said hello to her. She said hello back without hesitating or even turning her head to look at me. Right after that, she sprung to her feet and walked away. I thought that was all quite weird, but I didn't really think anything else of it. I'd say about 30 minutes later, I was packing up my stuff, and I left soon after. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I'd had a pretty great day relaxing there all in all. Once I was home, I started making myself some dinner when I heard my phone start ringing. I walked over to my purse on the counter and pulled it out. It was my mom. We started talking about the usual things when all of a sudden, I noticed what looked like a square piece of folded paper sticking out from inside my purse. In the midst of our conversation, my mom continued talking whilst I pulled this mystery paper out and unfolded it. I was confused because I was absolutely sure I hadn't put anything like that in there. I dropped my phone when I read what was written inside. The note said this: "I was going to rob you and stab you in the throat, but you just looked too peaceful laying there." I picked up the phone and told my mom what happened, remembering that girl on the beach. We both nearly passed out together. Call centers can be a weird place to work at. You talk to people from all over the country, and even sometimes all over the world. Most people are a little more, frustrating than anything. The same questions every single day will eventually drive you a little bit batty. I only wish those calls were the worst ones I've ever gotten, though. I got the job as a customer service rep for a cable company just after I finished college. The hours really sucked too. 3 in the afternoon all the way until midnight. But the money was pretty good, and there were some medical benefits as well. It wasn't too great, but with loans to pay back, I took the first full-time job that came along. While some people need help with their cable after 10 p.m., there aren't that many of them, as you can imagine. 5 days a week, I was stuck at my desk taking calls from old men having trouble accessing skin flicks until midnight. Most of the night, though, was spent gossiping with another late-night employee. The calls never stopped for too long. It was the middle of spring when I got the first weird call. At first, this guy just sounded like your regular old confused customer, having trouble accessing some of the more mature channels. A little heavy breathing and a little stuttering, the usual. I was about to give him the usual spiel about turning off the parental locks when he cut me off. Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like?" he muttered through these deep, excited breaths. Now that was far from the first prank I'd ever gotten. My immediate response was to hang up and mutter to my coworker about these annoying pricks on the other end. I shoved that memory of that call out of my head for a solid week or so. We got all manner of calls, so one stupid one wasn't enough to faze me. Late on a Friday night, though, just before midnight or so, a familiar breath entered my ears as I picked up the line. "Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like?" he asked. I do all the... I ended the call before he could finish what he was saying. Just my luck to get this creep calling in a second time. I asked my coworker if he'd ever gotten a call like that before, but he only shrugged and said it wasn't anything that was normal. I hoped that not engaging with this creep would be enough to get him to give up. 2 times wasn't much to be concerned with anyway. By the 3rd call, though, it was starting to get more personal. I hate how well I remember it. The weirdest thing about this 3rd call was how normal it started. It was a completely normal-sounding man on the other end, asking about our company and how long we'd been in business, what city the company was based out of, and the cost of our regular plans. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Then, though, he whispered into the phone line, "I want to know what the flesh of a pretty young girl tastes like." My mind reeled as I ended the call as quickly as possible. For a prank caller, this guy was getting pretty tricky, and he was real dedicated too. I was almost starting to worry at that point, but then again, I didn't hear from him again for a while. I thought he must have given up the ghost or gotten bored or whatever. I didn't really care. I just wanted him to stop calling me. I wasn't going to be complaining when they did stop for an entire month. I was in the clear, and I even started to forget that strange caller and his creepy desires. I was over it, and had gone back to being generally annoyed by the other regular customers. I should have known better, though. A call came in one night, at nearly 1:15 midnight. It didn't even go to me, though. My coworker, the only other person working at the time, picked up the call. "Hey," he called to me. "This guy on the line's asking for you?" I told him to pass the call over to me and I'd handle it. It wasn't the first time someone had dealt with me previously and wanted to continue with the same representative. I didn't really think anything of it. "Hello, how can I help you this evening?" I mindlessly asked into the phone. "I want to know what your flesh tastes like." The familiar voice breathed in my ear. "I want to savor it on my tongue." "Leave me alone!" I screamed into the phone. To my horror, the phantom voice laughed at my fury. He laughed and laughed until I ripped the headset off my head and stormed away from my miniature cubicle, tapping my finger hard against the end call button as I left. Maybe it was because he'd finally gotten a reaction out of me, or maybe because he was getting worse, but the calls ramped up to at least once a day now. I did everything I could to get him to leave me alone after that. I told my supervisors, I switched my shifts at the company, I even called the police. Somehow, they were unable to trace the call. At least they tried, though. The mystery caller kept calling 2, 3, sometimes even 4 times a day now, each time telling me how much he desired to taste human flesh, often mentioning my flesh in particular. He mentioned other people he wanted to eat too, but it was always that he wanted to eat another human being. After a month of that, I quit. No 2 weeks notice, no offers to try and stick it out. I went to sit down at my desk one morning and realized I just couldn't bring myself to put my headset on. I couldn't handle this anymore. I got up and went to my boss and told him I was done. To my surprise, no one really judged me for it either. I probably stuck it out longer than they expected. I left with a glowing letter of recommendation and mumbled words of apology that they couldn't do more for me. I spent a lot of time hiding out in my bedroom after I left the call center. After a couple of weeks without getting any weird phone calls or having to talk to anyone really, I started to go out again. Life started getting back to normal and I stopped thinking about that weird caller. While I hadn't forgotten about the terrible calls, I was able to push them out of my head for the most part. I even lined up a job interview that I was supposed to go to yesterday. The job was nothing special, but it was a huge step for me. I was all set to go for that interview. My suit was ironed, my hair was all styled. I felt better than I had in months. I even found myself smiling while I was waiting for the bus to come pick me up. That's when I heard it. Somebody leaned in and whispered in my ear as their breath washed over me. I know what the flesh tastes like now. I like it. I spun around hard as panic came over me, my eyes scanning the group of people moving toward the bus, but no one stood out from the crowd in particular. My mysterious caller had somehow found me in real life. Worse, it seemed he'd gone through with his sick, twisted fantasy. I didn't get on the bus. How could I? That guy was on there, and he knew who I was. But I didn't know him. I skipped my interview and went right back to my bedroom. At least it was safe in there. Now though, my cell phone always keeps ringing non-stop. I don't answer it if I don't know the number, no matter how long it rings for. It's just safer to let it ring away. I never tell anyone this story, but reading all the stories on here, I feel like I need to post about it. Because of this, I don't go on walks alone, or even with friends, unless it's a very public place. Even then, I'm somewhat paranoid. With that being said, my friends and family had just moved to a new town 15 minutes from where I lived. It was a complete ghost town, with one tiny grocery store, a single post office, and a school. This town was so secluded and quiet that I rarely ever even saw cars drive by. One night, as we were unpacking boxes, we heard a knock at the door. It was a big, tall man with a shotgun in his hands. Being from Oklahoma, this could mean either you're meeting your hick new neighbor, or that it's actually someone wanting to harm us. Turns out it was just the hick neighbor coming to introduce himself. He was also fairly nice. He told my friend's mom about the lack of police and how everyone needs to carry their own guns in order to protect themselves. The police are usually of no help, being so far away. He talked about how these areas can be dangerous and advised my friend's mom to get a gun and keep it with her. At this time, I was 13 years old, and knowing this information, you would think I would simply stay my ass inside and not wander about the streets of dangerous hillbilly ghost town. But that's exactly what I did. There was no service, no cable, and nothing to do except go outside. We would walk to the store and get snacks, walk to the school and play on the playground. The majority of the time, we wouldn't see a single car or person. The same clerk was in the grocery store on every walk we took. There was a day my dad had brought me to her house, and right off the bat we walked to the park. That day I was sick to my stomach, but I was so eager to see my friend that I went anyways. I had a terrible feeling, and now that I'm older and have experienced bad anxiety, I can now say that day I was experiencing some pretty severe anxiety. I didn't know why I felt this way though. When we got there, we actually ended up hanging out with an old friend who had transferred to this school a year prior. After he left, we sat down on the bench for what felt like ages, taking selfies and talking. All of a sudden, a stereotypically creepy van pulled up to the park. Now, my friend was and still is braver than I was or will ever be, and she was always the daredevil one in our friendship. For some reason, around this time, I just assumed it was a family coming to play. My anxiety was gone, but my friend was real scared. She immediately got a bad feeling when the van pulled up, and I could tell she was ready to leave. We decided to stay though and see who this was before just running off. Of course, like something out of a movie, two giant men jumped out and literally started barreling over to where we were. We immediately started to walk away, but they tried to follow and grab us. At this point, we began to run. They jumped back into their van and started to follow us. I have no idea how they didn't catch up to us, but we ran as fast as we could up the road and straight to the grocery store. I was so horrified when we got inside I couldn't even speak. That sick feeling I felt on the way to my friend's house made complete sense to me now. My mom was always watching true crime growing up, and sometimes she would even have me watch with her. I was already really scared to walk around because of that. But even with all that fear, I never thought it would happen to me. The van parked outside across the street while we stayed in the store, but eventually they drove off. We walked home with no way to call anyone, thinking they could be waiting for us around every corner with absolutely no one around to help us. That was the scariest day of my life. I didn't tell anyone for years, which was kind of stupid of me, but at 13 years old, I didn't exactly know what to do in this kind of situation. I'm turning 21 soon, and this story still keeps me up at night sometimes. I can't help but imagine what would have happened if they had captured me and my friend. Where would we have gone, and what would have happened to us? I'd like to tell you my story now. I was working as a driver for Uber about a year ago. As you might guess, doing that job resulted in meeting many strange people. Many drunk people, quiet people, all sorts of people, and in a few rare cases, some creepy people as well. This story does not involve a creepy person though. It involves my one and only encounter with a terrifying person. One evening, around 11 p.m. or so, I was getting pretty tired. I had already been working for several hours, but I decided to pick up just one more person, then call it a night and go home. This last person's pickup location was in a very bad neighborhood. I had dropped off another group of people here about a week before this night. I pulled up to the house set up as the pickup location, and immediately noticed it looked quite run down and vacant as well. It didn't look like anybody should or even could be living in it. All the same though, a man walked out of the house before I could even inform him on my phone that I had arrived. He looked completely normal, which was a huge relief. He jumped in the back and said hello, and thanked me for picking him up from such a strange location. I asked him where he needed to go. He didn't give me the address like I'm used to though. He just told me to head down the street and make a right. I didn't think anything of this. After following his instructions, he told me to then get on the freeway, go about 15 miles, then get off on Lincoln Boulevard. I was happy to hear this, as it wasn't all that far away from where I lived at the time. This being my last ride of the night, I didn't want to have to drive a huge distance just to get back home after. After getting off on Lincoln, he told me to drive another 4 miles up, then make a right turn. After he gave those directions, I started getting a bit uneasy. After driving those 4 miles and making that right turn, he told me to make a left about a mile up the street. Upon hearing those instructions, I felt even more nervous. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but those were the exact instructions to get to my neighborhood. I followed his instructions and made the left as I was asked to. I asked what was next after this. He didn't say anything for a few moments. I looked in the rearview mirror, only to feel my heart sink. He was just staring at me, with his eyes bug-eyed wide. I repeated myself, and he finally replied, "Go another mile, then make a left on Patterson." I can't tell you the level of fear I reached after hearing that. That was the exact same street I lived on. Did this guy know where I lived? Was he directing me back to my house? My heart started to race. I made the left turn, then asked what was next. He responded instantly. "Up that street there. My house is on the right." I felt sick. I kept driving and started to slow down a bit. I tried not to look at it as I passed by my own home slowly. "Which one is it?" He was silent for a moment, then whispered in a quiet and sinister voice, "You just passed it." I stopped the car. My heart was now throbbing. I looked in the rearview mirror to see him now smiling. I asked him again which one it was. I was still looking at him. He replied to me without breaking his gaze or his smile. 1905. I jumped out of my car after hearing him say that. That was my address. I started running into the middle of the street. I took out my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. He jumped out of the car on the opposite side of me. I ran into my neighbor's bushes and made the choice to knock on their front door. I pounded furiously for a moment. I turned around to see where the man was. I was expecting to see him right behind me. But now he was nowhere in sight. I told my neighbors what had just happened. A police officer showed up shortly after that, but the man was already gone. Your guess is as good as mine as to how he knew where I lived, what my address was. I still have no idea how he knew that. I didn't see him again either. I never picked up another person after that. A little background information about me to start. I have PD, or panic disorder. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a mental illness that causes extreme anxiety, severe panic attacks, and a slew of other problems. I've been suffering from this for over a year now, and while it is getting better, it's still very difficult to deal with, and keep this in mind. My husband and I have been married for over a year now. During most of the time we've been married, unfortunately, I was undergoing medical issues that no doctors could seem to explain. I was having panic attacks all the time, and it would be so severe I would have to be taken to the ER. They would have to literally sedate me just to calm me down. I was also losing weight at an exponential and very alarming rate, becoming visibly sicker and sicker as time went on. Not even a month after we married, I lost my job and was homebound, while my husband worked a second shift, which was 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. He would arrive home around 4, leaving me alone most of the time. My parents and younger brother did live close by, perhaps a 10-minute drive at most, but at the moment my mother and father were unable to watch over me. They did call as frequently as they could, but that was as much as they could do. In May, I was told by doctors I was literally at death's door, and unless something happened real quick, my family was going to lose me. I was given medications to help with the panic attacks and to get me to eat and the like. They wanted to hospitalize me, but I refused. My parents decided that when they and my younger brother went to Florida the next month, they were taking me with them. Again, keep in mind I was both anxious and extremely sick. At the same time, my real issues had just begun, and not with me either, but with our neighbors. You see, we'd never actually met our neighbors personally before this point. My husband lived in the trailer for a month on his own before we married, and he always said they were a bit odd, but they didn't seem to be of much concern. Once I came into the picture though, that all changed. The person who'd lived in the trailer before us was actually a cousin of mine, who'd rented from another cousin and his wife who lived states away. Nora was a huge druggie and a drug dealer, so people got real used to getting their fixes and drugs at the trailer we now lived in. A few months before we moved in, she got in trouble with the law and landed in jail for quite some time. I guess our neighbors, who according to our landlords were drug addicts and raging alcoholics as well, thought perhaps that she was back. I'm not quite sure. I suppose this is because I was so sick that they never actually saw who I was. They only knew that I was living there. They became active at night. During the day, they were mostly quiet. Every once in a while, they would do something outside, but for the most part, nothing really happened. It would always start after my husband left for work. My car would still be there, which I guess told them that at least someone was still home. It started off innocently enough, driving up and down in front of the house, parking in the road directly in front of it, and waiting for a long time. Sometimes they'd honk the horn at me, but I just ignored them. Several times I even called my parents because they'd stuck around so long, asking them what to do. They said for the time to just ignore them. Perhaps they thought Nora was back, and after some time they'd get the hint it was new people and leave me alone. So that's exactly what I did for a while. When they started driving up the driveway though and stopping at my porch, that's when I first called the cops. All I was told was that as long as they didn't encroach on my actual property, there was nothing they could actually do. They advised me to turn on the lights in my house and signal I was home. Needless to say, I did not sleep very well, despite needing to. My husband had the weekends off, and as you can guess, there were never any issues during the weekends. It was insane and infuriating. Everyone did believe me when I said I was having problems, but there was only so much they could do to help. My father-in-law brought over one of his shotguns, knowing that I was a good shot. He told me to use it if I ever needed it. One night, my husband was at work, and I guess my body finally shut off. I fell asleep for once, only to be awoken around 1 a.m. by the sound of our neighbor's truck tearing out from behind the trailer. I jumped up and looked outside, only to see them shooting out of our driveway. They started speeding up and down in front of the house. I called the cops again. I called my dad and mom, and my dad came over because I was in full panic attack. My dad called my husband, who then came home immediately. They even left tire marks in the grass behind the trailer, but nobody could necessarily prove it was them, despite me describing their truck down to the exact dents. My dad told the cops this had been going on long enough, but again, not enough evidence or proof. A week. Just one more week until I could go with my family to Florida. I somehow managed to be a bridesmaid in my older brother's wedding, despite being so sick. I was doped up on medications to keep me calm, so I wouldn't have a panic attack. I don't recall much about that day other than it rained because of this. My husband, naturally, was at work. When I got back, I was sitting at home and our 2 cats were asleep rather soundly. I was playing my 3DS with the TV on for some background noise. Around midnight, my cats suddenly woke up and became unglued. They ran to the side door, then to the front door, growling and hissing, their hair standing on end. They had never behaved that way before, so I started to get up to see what it was they were freaking out about. And then I heard it. "So, how are we gonna do this?" I froze. I heard them. I heard their footsteps as they paced up and down on the front porch. I wasn't sure how many people there were, but I knew for a fact I could hear at least 3 distinct voices. The curtains were closed and the lights were off, but the TV was on. Surely they could hear it from so close. They got quieter. I heard their footsteps stomping all around. I grabbed my phone, shakily swiping until I found my dad's number and called him. "Hello? They're here! They're here!" I remember sobbing. "I'm on my way. Call the cops." I hung up on him, then heard them talking amongst themselves about how they were going to break in, what they wanted. I ran into the bedroom and grabbed the gun. I opened the chamber to see it fully loaded and called the cops myself. I left the lights off. I decided I was going to have them caught this time. I was not going to let them run off. I told them what was going on. As sick as I was, I managed to hold the shotgun to my shoulder pointed at the door, remembering everything my dad had taught me about shooting. I was scared out of my mind, though. I was breathing hard. "Calm your breathing, hun. You said they're outside?" "Yes. I heard one say they heard me, and then the other said it wouldn't be a problem." "Police are on their way, sweetie, I promise. I'm armed." "Excuse me?" "I said I'm armed." I could hear the people outside now talking about that, then silence. I heard their footsteps leaving, then saw the lights to my dad's truck. I lowered the shotgun and ran outside, my dad and younger brother running out of the truck. My dad had his Judge in his hand, which is a pistol that shoots shotgun rounds. My younger brother was holding a knife. I thanked the dispatcher for everything, and about this time the cops pulled up. I told my dad and younger brother to disarm. They put their weapons in the truck while I took my gun inside and put it on the top of the kitchen table. My dad told me to get back in the house and for my younger brother to go with me. As soon as I stepped inside, the panic attack hit. My dad came inside for a moment and hugged me, telling me how brave I had been, especially for holding it in as long as I did. I listened as he went back outside. The cops found footprints in an area on the porch where apparently the men had tried to break in at one point. They had all scattered, though, leaving it difficult for the cops to trace exactly where they had come from. My dad told them it was the neighbors. My landlords actually called and told the cops it was more than likely them as well. The cops noticed some of the footprints went to the neighbor's yard, but they weren't home, of course. I remember my dad and younger brother standing outside just as the cops pulled up, yelling as loudly as they could that they would drop them if they ever saw them around me again. I noticed my dad was crying as well. He wasn't the type of person to do that. My whole life, I've seen my dad cry maybe a handful of times. My dad had been scared he wouldn't get there in time. and maybe I would hesitate to protect myself. I wasn't going to let them get away with this anymore, though. That night, my husband came home from work and hugged me tightly. I thought my lungs would burst because it was so tight. I reassured him I was okay, though. A week later, I went to Florida. Time went on, and I started getting better. As for my neighbors, I never had problems with them again after. I'm not sure if it was the cops actually going to their house, or my dad and younger brother threatening to kill them. Maybe it was me, them hearing me say that I was armed. I don't know, and I don't really care. They're still there, but I don't think they'll try anything ever again. Every August, the county I lived in would throw a huge fair. There were games, rides, shows, and food, all that good stuff. They'd come around for about 2 weeks. Then they would take it all down, and I'd have to wait an entire year for them to come around again. I want to say this happened in 2008 or so. I know I was around 7 at the time, just tall enough to ride something I had wanted to go on for a long time. I convinced my mom to let my cousin Jared and I ride it. Jared was about 2 years older than I was. My mom trusted us to be safe, so we ran off to ride the ride. After we did so, Jared had to use the bathroom real bad. The fair only had porta potties though, so I had to just wait outside for him to finish. And that's when this random man just walked right up to me. He told me that I had to go with him right now. When I asked him why, he said my parents had called on him to come collect me. I know I should have run away or called out to Jared or something, but this guy said he knew my parents. It's an obvious lie looking back. He didn't even mention their names, but I thought surely if he knew my parents, then he wasn't a stranger. This guy grabbed my hand and started to take me out to his car. Now, to get to the parking lot of this fair, you had to walk a fairly long time, probably about 10 minutes. It's a huge field where they had the fair set up. I asked him where we were going. He told me they said they were going to McDonald's to get some food. The closest McDonald's was about an hour away, and I had just eaten not long before. I said I wasn't hungry, and I wanted to go see my mom instead. I started to try and walk away, but he grabbed my arm and started dragging me towards his truck. I froze. I knew this was a bad guy now, but I was in some sort of state of shock. I can't even remember if I tried to move or scream. All that really came out though was a strangled whisper. I remember crying without making a sound. We were right next to his truck now, and he was trying to force me into the back seat. That's when this young couple happened to see him. They must have seen me panicking and crying because the girl ran right up to me and grabbed me. She started screaming. The guy came over too. The bad man was already in his truck though. He ran over the other guy's foot as he sped away. That young couple saved my life that day. I have no idea what that guy would have done to me if he got me to go to where he was actually heading. I know for sure it wasn't McDonald's though. The couple walked me to the entrance as an announcement was made saying there was a missing child. My mom and Jared arrived shortly after. They were both crying. I remember running up to her bursting into tears before whispering why she'd asked that man to take me. She said she didn't know who tried to take me. We hugged and left after. We didn't go back to the fair again that year, or at all the next year either. My mom was paranoid the guy would still be there looking for children. I got over this fairly quickly though, and went on with my life. I only really remembered this because my girlfriend wanted to go on that same ride last year. A few months ago, I took in a new dog. Her original owners weren't able to bond with her, and they said she was unresponsive and disobedient, didn't have the look they wanted. I've got no idea what they were talking about. She's the best behaved dog I've ever known, and she's downright adorable as well. I'm used to people stopping me in the street so they can pet her. Usually, people will ask before they touch her, or at the very least, they'll say something. Oh my god, look at that dog. They let me know they're obviously gonna come over and say hello to her. I'm pretty much fine with that. What I'm not fine with is what happened on one of my earlier walks with her. I live in a tiny seaside town, and I kind of take my dog on a tour of all the areas closest to the sea. When I walk her, I'll walk along the beach, down the promenade, around the miniature lakes, and then home. Probably not smart to stick to the same route every single day, but I've switched things up since this happened. Anyway, we were at the final stage of our walk one evening, making a couple of laps around the lakes, when we walked past a man. Now, a lot of older men like to gather there on a regular basis. I didn't think much of one guy just sitting on a bench by the water. I told myself he was only staring because my dog was so cute. I passed him by, and then from behind me, I heard him say, "Sit." My dog did. She was much more obedient than her previous owners had let on. My dog sat down right away and looked up at me all happy, expecting a treat. I frowned and looked back at the guy. He was still on the bench just watching us. I quickly encouraged my puppy to start walking again. We hadn't even got 5 feet further down the path when the man commanded to my dog again. My dog did exactly what he said. I turned around, already glaring, and saw the man was now up on his feet. I told my dog to keep walking and pick up the pace as well, trying to get over to the path that led up to the main street. We were still nowhere near the path though, when the man yelled another command. My dog was about to do it, but she was starting to look at me confused. I was pretty terrified though. The man was now rushing over to us. He was catching up fairly quickly. He was close enough that even without my glasses, I could tell he had this huge grin on his face. At that point, I'd had enough. I forgot about getting to the path and scooped up my dog off the ground in my arms. I ran straight up the hill to the side of us and climbed over the small fence that separated the lakes from the street. The man didn't try to follow over the fence, but instead stayed at the bottom of the hill, looking up at us. He was no longer smiling anymore though. I'd never seen him before in my life, and I haven't seen him visit the lake again since then either. I really hope it stays that way. I don't know exactly what his intentions were that night, but it seemed to me he was using my dog's obedience to slow me down and keep me from getting away from him. I doubt they were good intentions, and I'm glad I didn't have to stick around to find out. This happened to me when I was 17 years old. I was just about to graduate high school. I was homeschooled and very encouraged to pursue entrepreneurship. I was trying to establish a photography business that I could run after graduating. In order to build up my portfolio, I decided to ask a few friends and acquaintances to model for me. I asked a girl I worked with if she and her husband would like to model a couples session with me. It would be a win-win, since they would receive free photos, and I would get to add them to my website as sample work. We planned a day to meet up, and I asked them to meet me at a local park one evening. Something you should know about this park is that it's pretty far out in the country. It has soccer fields, baseball fields, a golf course, and walking trails, so it's a fairly large plot of land that's also fairly secluded. The only house in view of the entire park is the caretaker's home, directly across the street from the entrance. Unless there's an event or a weekend, there's usually not many people there at all. I felt pretty confident about meeting up there, because I was only planning to arrive about 15 minutes early to set up. I wouldn't be alone there long. The park has an entrance where you can drive down a road into the parking lot to get to all the sports fields, playground, and also the pond. The front of the park had a large grassy strip, which is where I was planning to set up for my photos. I bypassed the entrance and pulled into a little dirt section at the front of the park. I began to unload all my props. I was always taught to be a cautious person, especially as a young woman. I took a quick glance around to see if anyone else was around. I saw one car in the parking lot, and two guys tossing a ball in the baseball field, along with their dog. Across the street, I could see the caretaker out in her yard, so I felt a lot better about things. I would keep an eye out, but I continued to set up my things fairly peacefully. I would glance up every now and then and see the two men were still on the baseball field. I had no reason to believe they would bother me, but something in my gut told me to just keep watch. The couple I was waiting on seemed to be running late. I finished my setting up and glanced up to check on the two guys. To my horror, they were gone. The car was still there, but the men and their dog were nowhere in sight. There was a bit of a hill in front of me that blocked some of the park entrance from sight. Maybe they had decided to walk one of the nature trails. Something in my gut, though, was telling me that something was wrong here. I looked at the caretaker's house, and she had gone back inside. I was all alone now. I couldn't get everything back into the car quickly, so I just grabbed my camera equipment and hopped inside. I locked the doors, turned on the ignition, and got my phone out. Literally, as soon as I got in my car, I could see the two guys running up over the hill towards me with their dog. I felt my gut feeling melt into panic. You have to understand, there was no reason for them to be running at me like this. It was literally just an open grassy yard. If their dog needed to relieve himself or something, there was plenty of woods at the edge, or the nature trail itself. Heck, the walk to the pond, all of which were way closer to them than where I was. They walked around my setup, and when they got to my car, one guy went around the front, and the one holding the dog on the leash circled around the back. I assumed they realized I had already noticed they were coming, and I was no longer vulnerable. They continued to circle me for a few moments before they rejoined together and walked further down, up and around the soccer field. Once I felt like I was no longer in danger, I glanced down at my phone, only to see the couple I was supposed to meet up with had apparently forgotten our appointment and were at the beach right now. I was so fed up at that point, I jumped out of the car, snatched up all my props, and shoved them inside. This was my first experience of how scary it can be to be a female out alone. I've had multiple experiences since then, but this is the one that sticks out to me the most. I'm absolutely certain those guys intended to do me harm. What kind of match would a 17-year-old girl be against two grown men and a pit bull? One thing's for certain, I'm not going back to that park alone. This happened 2 years ago on our anniversary. My wife and I were celebrating 3 years of marriage, and we decided to both take the day off work and go for a drive down to the beach together. And what a drive it was, about 3 hours one way. The drive was amazing though. We had fantastic conversation and enjoyed various sights along the way. When we arrived there was only a few hours of daytime left, but we didn't much mind that. We kind of liked the idea of walking along the sand at night to gaze out among the stars and listen to the ocean peacefully, without the usual noise that comes with visiting the beach during the day. We ate dinner at a nice steakhouse right out on the water, and when we finished, we decided it was time to hit the beach finally. From the restaurant, we walked to our car, which was parked in the lot right next to the beach entrance. My wife grabbed her sweater and a blanket, while I grabbed a 6-pack and a small cooler we had brought. We headed towards the sand and went through a very old wooden fence with an opening cut out from it. We walked out toward the water and marveled at the sight of it. The moon was lighting our way beautifully. We stopped and chose a nice spot about 30 yards away from the waves crashing against the sand. About 70 yards, I'd say, from the wooden fence leading back to our car. We unfolded the blanket and sat down on top of it. After a few minutes of talking, kissing, and drinking, we laid down together. We were truly amazed by all the stars out in the sky. It was a gorgeous sight. I'd say about 15 minutes later, though, I felt a presence. I was still watching the stars, but I felt like now there was somebody else watching us. I sat up and noticed my wife had already drifted off and fell asleep. I looked around the beach, but I couldn't see anything immediately. It was complete serenity almost. When I turned completely around though, this is when my heart stopped in my chest. About 15 feet away from us, there was a man sitting behind us in the sand. This caught me completely off guard and scared the shit out of me, mainly because he didn't speak when he noticed that I had seen him. Instead, he sat down in the sand closer to us with a giant smile on his face. A giant, extremely creepy smile. I was surprised to see this, and at first I didn't know what to say. I glanced at my wife again, who was fully asleep in that moment. I'm not sure why, but I got the sense our lives were in real danger. I looked up and noticed the man's smile had disappeared and turned into a furious look. He then pulled out a huge knife from underneath him. I shook my wife awake, at the same time calling out the man. "What the fuck are you doing? Are you serious?" I was scared, but I did the best firm voice I could. My wife regained her focus and spun around to look at the man. At that moment, he smiled again. His giant grin made me shiver. My wife gasped when she saw he had a knife. He didn't say a word and didn't respond either. Instead, he clutched that knife so hard his knuckles looked white and took a step towards us. My wife gasped again. I forced myself to do something. I stood up as well. "What do you want? You can have our phones and our keys, but I have no cash, man." The man looked completely insane though, which was terrifying. He was wearing a brown suit, all ripped up looking. It looked like he'd pulled it out of a trash can or something. His long brown hair was a mess, and he looked almost homeless. Once again, he made no attempt to respond. After 15 seconds of unnerving silence, he finally did something. He began to run up to us very quickly. My wife screamed, and I almost had a heart attack. He stopped right before he stepped foot onto our blanket, and once again his smile turned into a crazy, angry-looking frown. I spoke one last time. "Dude, you can have everything, just be cool, man. You can have my beer." My voice was cracking. I was petrified. I tried to humanize myself to this guy and make him feel almost welcome to our stuff, like what he was doing wasn't a big deal. Then he finally spoke in a completely normal, insane voice. "I don't drink." Then he turned around and just walked away. Relief hit me like a ton of bricks. I kneeled down and grasped my wife's shoulder. The man continued walking away. At some point, though, he stopped and turned around again. He didn't look at us, though. Instead, he looked up at the sky for a moment, then turned around once more and made his way out through the fence. He disappeared into town. My wife started tearing up, and I suggested we go now. We very quickly grabbed our belongings and started walking down the beach toward a different entrance, leading to a parking lot next to the one our car was parked in. After circling around the huge parking lot, walking around the restaurant we ate at, we saw people laughing and talking outside. They had no idea the terror we just experienced. We approached our car, got inside, and drove away. We were pretty much silent on the way back home. My wife just hung her head out the window, and we haven't visited the beach ever since. Something very creepy happened to me on Christmas. I had celebrated the holiday that morning with my family and went to see my parents on Christmas night as well. I had to go into work, though, to finish up a proposal I was working on for a new potential client. I obviously didn't want to go, but it had to be finished nonetheless. I worked in a building downtown that was fairly close to a few nightclubs and bars. My office is on the 23rd floor, and in my position, I have an office, but most of the floor is filled with cubicles. My office is in the very far corner next to my boss's, so to get to that area, you have to walk by all the cubicles in the center. I didn't get there too late, probably around 8 or 9 or so, but there was nobody else there. This was my second time going it alone. It was pretty peaceful, actually. If I let my imagination run wild, however, I would get spooked quite easily. As I walked the path next to the cubicles, I was reminded of what I was currently missing at home while looking at all the Christmas lights strung up, decorating people's workspaces. There were no actual lights on, but it was lit up well enough by all these Christmas lights that I could still see. I reached my office and unlocked it. I walked inside but didn't close the door. My computer and desk faced away from my door, so I couldn't see anyone that approached my door. On work days, I always found this very annoying, as I never knew who would be knocking until I got up and opened the door to check. I sat down and began working as quickly as possible. I wanted to get home as soon as I can. After a while, I'd say about an hour into it, I heard the main entrance door close. I'd never heard it open, but when it closed, it made a distinct noise that was unmistakable. I wasn't too spooked at this point, though. I was just curious as to who else was unlucky enough to have to come in and finish something with me. I got up from my desk and walked out onto the floor. I looked around, but I didn't see anybody there. I called out fairly loudly, "Hello?" Nobody responded at that moment, though. I started to get paranoid and freaked out because I definitely just heard the entrance door close. Somebody was here. Either they'd left immediately or they were still in here with me hiding, not responding to what I was saying. I was just about to turn around and go back into the office and try to brush off what I heard when I saw a head stick up out of the cubicle on the opposite side of the floor. Whoever it was looking right at me. I could see it appeared to be a man, but I couldn't make out any details of his face. I thought it must be one of my coworkers messing with me, so I shouted over to him, "Hey, what a time to have to come in, huh?" I hoped whoever it was would stand up and laugh with me, but they didn't. The man didn't move at all. This scared the crap out of me, so I tried to make conversation again. "Hey, guy, you know I can see you, right?" He didn't move at all. I wasn't sure what to do now. I was scared shitless, so I felt through my pocket for my keys. They were still there. I started walking down the path toward the entrance door, the whole time keeping a firm eye on this guy. As I was walking, I think he was watching me go. I looked over to the entrance door for just a second. One damn second. When I looked back, the man was already gone. After seeing this, I thought, oh my god, is he moving over toward me? I jogged the rest of the way to the door and rushed through it. I jogged over to the elevator too and slammed that button down hard. I turned around quickly as I heard the entrance door slam closed. It made that same distinct noise as before. The elevator door thankfully opened right away and I went inside. I hit the first floor button and the door closed quickly. I didn't see the guy following me. I drove home and told my wife what happened. I also had to call my boss and tell him the reason for not finishing my proposal that night. Thankfully, he was fairly understanding. I went back 2 days later with everyone else. I never found out who that guy was or what that was all about. Nothing was stolen or tampered with to my knowledge, so what could he have been there for that night? This happened when I was around 12 years old. Me and my family lived in a small apartment, but it felt cozy to me. We knew some of our neighbors and would sometimes even invite them to our house. All of them were pretty great people. At the time, I used to sleep next to my brother's bed and felt safe with his presence, like nothing bad could happen to me. The only thing I can really say was bad about this apartment was that our bedroom was right next to the bedroom of our neighbor, which was a little higher up than ours. If you wanted to see their room, you could do so by getting on top of a chair, while they could see directly into our entire bedroom with no effort. Despite it being somewhat freaky, I didn't think much about it, since, like I said, I had my brother sleeping in the same room, and what could possibly go wrong with him there? Oh, how innocent I was. The day everything started, I had barely finished my dinner and decided I would like to go to sleep early. My brother was not in the room at the moment because of this. Everything seemed fine until I woke up and saw something that still gives me chills to this day. What I saw was a silhouette of a person right next to the window. While I couldn't see their face at all, I knew they were staring at me. I remember screaming as loud as I could and running desperately to the living room where my mom was watching TV. I explained what happened to her, but she didn't seem very bothered at all. She simply said, "Oh, okay," and continued watching TV like nothing had happened. A few days after that event, I was feeling way better about things, but even then, I decided to keep the curtains closed just in case. That was until one day, when I woke up in the middle of the night for some reason and had the idea of needing to open the curtains. As you already expected, she was just staring right at me once again. Like the first time, I couldn't see her face at all, just a black figure. I don't know how many times she'd done that, but for the following days after, I would wake up 2 to 3 times every night. Well, this time I kept the curtains closed. I could tell she was there trying to watch me sleep. A few days later, I decided to tell my parents the full extent of what was going on, and that's when things got even creepier. They said that on that side, right next to our apartment, lived an elderly woman who was sick and had her son taking care of her. They said that they would leave to take out the trash, and she would sneak up behind them while patiently waiting for them to turn around. I tried telling them how I felt so paranoid that she was always watching me. She's just a sick old lady. Scaring people is probably the highlight of her week. Come on, just ignore her and go back to sleep. Well, nowadays, I don't care much about that. I remember being very angry with them at the time. Why weren't they trying to help me? I did exactly as they said. I just tried my best to ignore her staring every night while keeping the curtains closed. It took some time, but I finally started to forget about this experience. That was until a few weeks later, when things took a turn for the far worse. From my mother's perspective, our family was always different from others. My mom was the one working all day, while my dad would be at home with us. So he would always bring me and my brother to school, then go pick us up when it ended. One day, I was at school waiting for my dad to arrive, when a friend came up to me and said she could bring me home with her dad's car. I completely forgot my father was coming to get me, so I said yes and went inside. When I got back home, I knocked at the door, but other than my 2 dogs barking, there was no response. I started to get anxious, so I kept knocking over and over until I heard a big sound coming from the old woman's apartment. That's when I realized I had made a big mistake. As soon as I heard that sound, I ran to the elevator and clicked the buttons as many times as I could. Our elevator had a window at the center, so I was terrified she would show up in it. Thankfully, she didn't. After I left the building, I decided to lay down on the street trying to process what happened. My friends saw me and invited me into their house. I watched cartoons while her dad called mine, explaining why I was not at school. When my dad came back, I ran to him and gave him a big hug while crying. My brother's class usually ended about 30 minutes after mine, so we had to go back to school together and get him. The entire time, I was expecting my father to scold me, but instead he was very calm and even told me he was thinking of buying a cell phone so I could message him if anything happened. After that experience, I was even more terrified of the old woman. I kept the curtains closed like usual and kind of got used to it. Eventually, we moved to a different house, and I never saw that woman again. Not that I would be able to recognize her really, since every time I saw her at the window, her face was completely black. That's how my story ends. Thankfully, I didn't get to see how crazed she looked. I realize maybe this story is not as scary as some others you've heard, but in any case, I hope you enjoyed it. I have a very scary story to tell you. I was out of work and desperate for cash when I looked on Craigslist under gigs. A few years back, I'd responded to several ads, ranging from painting to helping people move or cleaning on a Sunday morning. Somebody called me and told me they had some work for me. They said the job was to clean a kitchen inside a small building that was recently closed down. He was apparently renovating it and needed me to show up and work in the evening, starting at around 7 p.m. and ending at around 1 or 2 in the morning. It was only going to be for tonight, but he promised to pay me in cash, $200 in fact. That sounded just fine to me. I had no problem with those hours either, as my last job was a graveyard shift anyway. So the man I was talking to gave me the address, and I told him I'd be there right on the dot at 7 o'clock. He sounded like a nice, normal guy. In fact, I showed up a little bit before 7 and approached the building. This building was one amongst many others downtown, but for some reason, this one looked eerily lonely. It had no windows and no lights were working outside in front of it either. I thought it might be some sort of bar that was closed down or something. I knocked on the big wooden door when I heard a noise coming from inside. Eventually, a man opened up. He was very tall and had this thick goatee. He looked to be in his 50s or so. He greeted me with a big smile and asked me to come on in. There was a single lamp lighting the room we were in, and indeed it looked like some sort of old bar. The room wrapped around another smaller room in the center of it. It looked as if he was painting the walls and working to fix the top of the bar, which was rotting old wood. He showed me to the central room, which seemed to be the kitchen. It was very dirty. All glasses and dishes were laying around everywhere. The oven was pulled out from the wall, showing the rotting drywall behind it. Sawdust and dirt was all over everything. He told me I was to clean this area and get as much done as possible before 2 a.m. I told him I'd work my ass off, and he pointed out some cleaning products sitting on the ground by the wall, with some rags to scrub as well. I asked if he had any gloves or anything. He said no, but that the sink in the corner still worked, and I could clean my hands whenever I wanted with it. That sucked. I was a bit hesitant to clean the stuff in there without gloves, but I remembered that big $200 he promised and moved past my disappointment. He told me while I was cleaning that he was going to be working outside at the bar. I asked where I should begin, and he said scrubbing the baseboards around the room. I told him okay, and he walked out. Fast forwarding a bit, I had been cleaning for about 2 hours now and was actually making a fair bit of progress. I was getting very thirsty. I told myself I would finish this one spot before exiting the room to ask if there was anything I could drink. I kicked myself for not thinking to bring a water bottle along with me. After finishing my goal, I stood up, only to realize I'd not heard him working outside the room at all. I hadn't heard anything, as a matter of fact. I walked to the door and opened it, only to find darkness, completely pitch black. At that instant, I became very nervous. "Hey, man, I'm making some good progress in here, if you want to see." I expected to hear him respond. He didn't, though. I looked around nervously, but I couldn't see anything. The only light source was gone. I looked back into the kitchen, which was bright and all lit up with the lights all on and working in the ceiling. I peered back out into the dark room. I began taking steps out into the room surrounding the kitchen. After taking about 10 whole steps, I stopped and was about to speak up again. To my horror, the door had slammed shut behind me. I was now engulfed in blinding darkness. I couldn't see anything. I spun around, waving my arms and walking back toward the kitchen door. My steps were small, as I had no idea what was in front of me. I was afraid I would run into something. In fact, I did, waving my hands around in front of me. I felt them hit something, only it was not a door. I'd smacked right into somebody's face. I scuttled backward, not hearing anything. Whoever I had just touched didn't react at all. I backed up until I hit the back wall and realized I must have been close to the entrance door of the building. I turned around and felt blindly for a doorknob. Luck was on my side. I quickly found it and pulled the door open. It was very dark outside at this point, and only a very small amount of moonlight came into the room, just enough for me to see the man standing against the kitchen door with a blank expression on his face. I ran out the door and never looked back. That's the last time I used Craigslist to find work. What was that guy doing? What was he going to do? It makes me sick just thinking about it. When I was a kid, there was a family of borderline mentally challenged people in my dad's small church group. I mean, the husband and wife were both very simple, as were their 2 kids as well. He was a diligent and careful truck driver. That job was his life, and he was so proud of it because he was a useful contribution to society instead of sitting around on disability pay. I guess a woman committed suicide by driving across the interstate median and running head-on into his truck. I remember him talking to my father right after it happened. Everyone still thought it was an accident at that point, and he kept stressing on how he had tried to avoid her, but it seemed like she was actively steering towards him. Lo and behold, a few weeks later, it came out the woman really was suicidal. She left a note saying something to the effect that she was leaving and never coming home. She had hit him on purpose. He was cleared immediately of any disciplinary action from his company, but he never worked again. I heard his family was evicted a few months later, and he was in a mental hospital because of his fragile psyche, which was done in by this incident. This was 20 years or so ago, so I don't know what happened to him in the end, but I hope one day he got better. This story begins about 5 years ago when I was a junior in high school. There was a boy in my grade, Jack, who didn't have a lot of friends. He's on the lower end of the autism spectrum, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome. That affected his ability to pick up on social cues in his interactions with peers. Although I always knew him to be a bit awkward, he was nice enough, and I felt badly that he spent so much time alone. Eating lunch alone, sitting alone at all the school activities. When he joined theater junior year, an activity I'd been a part of since I was 6, I decided to help in bringing him into the fold. Although more creative clubs do have reputations for being more accepting, it's still a difficult thing to join halfway through when everyone is already close-knit friends with everyone else. I would make my best effort to include Jack in conversations with the groups at rehearsals, talk to him one-on-one, invite him to sit with us at lunch. I even gave him my phone number to chat about things once in a while. When he asked me to hang out with him after a month or so of friendship, I said yes. I came to his family's barn and had a very nice time visiting with all the animals and eating dinner with his family. They said a few heartbreaking things throughout the dinner, like it was so nice to see him finally having a friend. They said they liked me much better than the one other friend he had, who I knew to be a kid who also had some disabilities. Unfortunately, this is around the time when our interactions stopped being healthy. He developed a severe attachment to me. It became very clear to me that he saw me in a romantic way, which I didn't return the feelings. Now that wouldn't have been too problematic if he hadn't started to pursue me in such an obsessive manner. He began texting me every hour of the day. If I ever didn't reply, I would receive another text emphasizing his last, or he would copy and paste the same message over and over again. If it were simply him saying hello to start a conversation, he would post it again and again and again until I finally responded. This was not always me ignoring him, mind you. Sometimes I was at work and unable to respond. Then, when I would unlock my phone, I'd have 10 messages from him like this. Additionally, if I did talk to him, he began pouring out every deep thought to me about depression and even having considered suicide in the past. While I'm a compassionate person who will do anything to help others, this worried me for multiple reasons. One, I'm not a trained therapist, and while I can offer some support, I don't always know the right thing to say to help. The last thing I want to do is say the wrong thing and trigger someone into hurting themselves. Additionally, I feared that him sharing these vulnerable thoughts with me and having me comfort him would make him feel as though the bond between us was closer than it was and cause him to latch on even tighter. I tried my best and advised him to speak to our school guidance counselor, which he declined as he claimed that only I could ever understand him. Around this time, he began following me to work. I didn't have a license at the time, so I had to walk from school to my after-school shifts. The store was less than a mile away, so it didn't really bother me. Jack would find me at my locker and start talking to me on my walk to the front door of the school building. I would say, "Bye, I have to go to work," but instead of waiting for his ride, he would follow behind me through the parking lot, down the street, and the entire way to where I worked. As the store I worked at is one where the customers come up to the counter and can't come inside, he would just lurk around in the parking lot for 20 minutes to half an hour, never buying anything, before eventually turning around and walking back to the school. My manager and I were both very disturbed by this whenever it happened, and I would hide in the back or clean until he left. Then the performance of our musical came, and the creep factor amped up even more. He was still constantly texting me, of course, but at this point I was going through a lot of mental health issues of my own. I didn't really have the patience to deal with this constant bothering. I replied every few days or so, but I wouldn't engage in more than casual conversation. He began to incessantly comment on everything I posted, Instagram, Facebook, responding to every single tweet. In person, he also followed me around constantly. More than once, he'd attempted to barge into the girls' dressing room and made several comments about my body and specifically my breasts to my face during that week. He happened to leave his phone on a table by me, and when I went to return it, I saw his lock screen was a photo that said, "Boobs are like the sun. If you wear sunglasses, you can stare at them as long as you like." As soon as the musical was over, I didn't have to see him on a regular basis and decided to block him on everything. His constant replies were really starting to freak me out. I told him multiple times that I couldn't always be there to talk to him, but he never listened. I blocked his number. Summer was actually quiet. I enjoyed the fact I didn't have to see or hear from him for a long time. Unfortunately, the school year brought back some contact with him, as he was now a recurring member of theater. He tried to confront me about blocking him in front of a large group of people. I just said we could talk about it later, and he failed to bring it back up. 2 weeks later, though, I got a Twitter notification that my phone contact Jack had joined Twitter as a user posing as the school debate team. I also had a notification saying he'd followed me. He made a fake account for a club that didn't even exist at school just in order to follow me. To my advantage, he'd used his real phone number or email when making that account. Therefore, I was able to quickly block him and told my close friends to do the same. For most part, my senior year went mostly quiet, except for an incident where he'd parked right next to me and tried to hit my car. I'm somewhat sure it was just because he's a really bad driver, but I've always had a tinge of doubt in my mind. I wish I could say the story ended there, that his crush just faded out with high school graduation, and the blocks on his account and number gave him enough closure to move on. Fast forward to fall of 2017. It's been about 2.5 years since I graduated from high school. I was going through my account on Twitter and adjusting some things, and saw I still had some people set to notifications that I didn't really talk to anymore. Some people I'd blocked from old grudges that I'd long since gotten over. I saw Jack was still blocked, and figured that everything had occurred so long ago that he must be over it by now. I decided to unblock him, assuming the chances would be rare he would comment or do anything. Likes are innocent enough. How wrong I was. In my defense, it did take him quite a while to notice, whether I just didn't pop up on his timeline for some time, or he just didn't use those applications for a while. I didn't hear from him until spring of 2018. 3 years after we'd left high school. He commented on something I posted, trying to start an argument. When I responded, he said he could never win an argument against me. Seemed innocent enough. I liked his comment and moved on. The next day, I got a message from him. "I see you're still the same as you were in high school." I responded for a bit and then stopped replying. It was only small talk, but I didn't want to contact him any further. I had a sinking feeling he was falling back in his old pattern. The next day, I got another message. Hey, are you there? I need to tell you something really important." I was taking a nap at the time, so I couldn't respond. 10 minutes later, according to the timestamp, he DM'd me the same message on Instagram and Twitter. Another 5 minutes later, I get the same message as a text, even though I didn't have his number. At this point, all the notifications woke me up. I was annoyed and felt I knew what he was going to say. I had a huge crush on you in high school, and I still do now. At this point, I was enraged. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, or interacted with him at all during that time. He made my favorite activity stressful and uncomfortable for me. He followed me to work several times. He knows nothing about the person I'd developed into in the years since I graduated. I decided to do what I hadn't done at that point, which was explicitly tell him about how inappropriate everything he'd done was. I knew he had a disability that made it hard for him to tell how people felt about things he said or did, and that's why I felt I needed to be brutally honest. I decided clearly he had some kind of fixation on me that seemed to transcend the boundaries of distance, time, or sight, so I blocked and deleted him on everything since. This incident happened about 7 or 8 months ago. I was the night shift desk clerk at a hotel, and let's just say there are a steady stream of creepers that pass through the lobby. I've had a ton of uncomfortable situations throughout my 3 years of employment there, but there was one particular guy that terrified me. It was around 2 a.m. or so when the guy walked into the lobby. The first thing I noticed was that he smelled god-awful, like burning plastic or something. I shrugged it off though, because at the time there were a lot of contractors that were in the area, working at a chemical plant nearby. I just assumed he was one of those workers, looking for a quick nap or a hot breakfast. The morning came by and my shift ended. Fast forward to my next shift the following night. The smelly man from the night before had left all of his belongings in his room and was now nowhere to be found. He'd only paid for a single night, so the housekeepers had to move all his things to the storage room so they could prepare the room for the next guest. Around 8:30 p.m. or so, I get a call from a police officer. Apparently, this guy was a wanted fugitive because he'd nearly beat his wife to death just 2 hours before he checked in. I informed them of the items he'd left in the hotel room. I get the whole "do not engage, he's a dangerous and violent offender" speech, and now I was really scared. They said it was highly unlikely he would come back, but to excuse myself politely and call them if he did show up. Well, needless to say, he ended up back in the lobby not even 20 minutes later. He demanded the luggage he'd left behind. At this point, I'm doing whatever it takes not to show fear, because now I'm fully aware of what this fucker is capable of doing. I tried to play it off like I didn't know where his things were, so I could make an excuse to go upstairs and call the police. I'm not too sure where they are. Let me go take a peek in a few of the storage units upstairs. If you could just wait here in the lobby, I'll be just a moment. He didn't say a word, so I assumed he was fine with that. As I started walking up the stairs though, about halfway up I realized he was following behind me. It was at this moment I started to flip out internally. I had no idea what to do. I began to fake search through a few different closets. After about 10 minutes of this, he started to get very hostile. "Where is my shit? I need my things right now!" He slammed his fist through a wall to make his point. There was now enough distance between us, though, that I felt comfortable making a run for it. I fumbled with my master card and managed to lock myself in the closest vacant room. He banged on the door for a while, but left a short time later. The cops came about 20 minutes after this, but he was already long gone. Of course, they searched through his bags, only to find a stash of meth and drug paraphernalia. That explains the awful scent and his determination to follow my every step. I quit shortly after, and I'm still unsure if they ever actually found him. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.